Okay, it is now my pleasure to start off our final panel before we get into our keynote luncheon to close us off. This panel is entitled Indigenous Stewardship and Resource Leadership. Dallas is going to moderate once again because nobody's ever sick of his voice. So I'd like to invite the other panelists to come up and join us now. Thank you very much.
All right. You know, it's been a good 2.5 days for me. Like I said, this is a real healing moment for me just from missing last year and being here this year and all the well wishes and whatnot. But I'm truly a proud uncle right now. I'm sitting beside my niece who's, you know, sat at our dinner table as a young girl, and to watch her grow into this prominent First Nations leader with specializing in stewardship initiatives for our communities. I'm a pretty happy dude right now, just as I am to have the rest of our panel. Stewardship and resource leadership, Indigenous stewardship and resource leadership. We have Christine Roberts, who I got to grow up in front of a little bit. You're not that much, I'll just stop on that, but I got to grow up in front of you. You know, there's a story about me stepping on one of your firstborn because I thought it was one of my sister's Cabbage Patch dolls in the middle of my mom's living room, and the time I got to spend with your husband growing up, and you see your kids growing into the young men that they're becoming is very awesome. And then we have Sharon Marshall joining us as well, and you know, stewardship and resource leadership is a bit of an ambiguous title because it has so many connotations. You know, when we started the Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference, everybody thought it was solely just about the development of natural resources. And we've learned over the years that no matter what we're gonna do, it takes spatial planning, it takes learning from our past, and it takes preparing for our future. But to be able to have boots on the ground in various communities up and down the coast, throughout the province and throughout the country now, in leading stewardship initiatives that are so vital to both the protection, management, and development resources, I think is just a fitting way to end off the panel portion of BC IROC. So I would like to just get this discussion going, and why don't we start off with you, Alexandra? Give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself and the role that you play.
Hello? Okay, just checking. Gela Kessler, Nugo Am, Nach Nagam, Gayukun, Lach Klauitzis, Glu Shishal. My name is Alex Thomas, that's my English name. My traditional name is Nach Nagam, which was given to me by my grandmother, which is Dallas's aunt. We did grow up sharing Christmas dinners, and that was a fond memory, and I never imagined as a little girl ending up here. So this is kind of maybe a good surprise for the both of us. I've really taken in the footsteps of my family. My mother is a forester by trade, and I am as well. I just recently graduated from the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Forestry, and it's always been my dream to work in our forests and work in my own territory for my nation or on behalf of my nation. I think for a lot of young First Nations folks, that's not an opportunity they get. So I felt very honored to be, representing myself that way at school, but also at functions like this, and now working alongside the Nanwakolas Council. I think it's super important to see Indigenous representation in those spaces. I myself often felt like I was kind of the only one in the room who looked like me, and I've been working really hard to change that by encouraging Indigenous youth to get involved, to get educated, to become, part of these conversations, because young voices matter just as much. We're the ones who are sitting at our elders' laps, listening to what they're saying. And it's our message now to kind of carry on those teachings. And we feel a lot of responsibility for that, or I do at least. And I try my best to live by those values and those guidelines that I was taught when I was younger. A short background about myself is I used to work as a Clout Seas Guardian Watchman in the Indigenous Stewardship Network. That was a really wonderful experience and kind of kicked off my desire to work in my territory because I was out there every single day, and it was probably the most wonderful job that any First Nations person could ask for. After that, I continued my schooling into forestry. I'm a bit more of a land type person, and I don't love the water that much, to be honest with you, and being on a boat every single day just wasn't what I was looking for. I much prefer trees and moss and just the forest and all the plants that come with it. Another part of the work that I do for Nanwakolas that I think is really relevant to this conversation is education to non-Indigenous folks about our culture, our values, our worldviews, and my personal most interesting part is Indigenous science. I think Indigenous science will really revolutionize and change how we even look at land management. I think our Indigenous worldviews and values really shape from the ground up how we are going to make those changes, but it's a really unexplored field, and I really feel a desire to further pursue that in my career and share what I know with others. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Sharon?
Hi. Wow, how do you follow that? Hello, everyone. Tanse. I'm Sharon Marshall, a Cree Métis mother of 2 young adults in university. I am from Treaty 6 territory, specifically Edmonton, but I've been on Vancouver Island for about 25 years. And in particular, I live on the Snanawas territory, and that's mid-Vancouver Island. I have been with ICLD for the last 3 months. I am an administrative professional, and I've worked with all levels of government and First Nations for the last 10 years. I'm an entrepreneur, and my business, I work primarily with the Indigenous women. I teach them how to become virtual assistants, and then I find them work. And I got into this work because of the remoteness of some communities and the lack of employment opportunities for women. And so as an entrepreneur, I don't know who here is, there's many entrepreneurs in the room, but it's a roller coaster ride being an entrepreneur. And so I was looking for an opportunity to work with an organization that really aligned well with my values and goals, and that's ICLD. I'm the Indigenous corporate lead, and so we work to train, well, first off, reconciliation is a big question mark to a lot of people. They hear of it, they know that we're in the age of reconciliation, but they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to action reconciliation, and so that's where we come in. And so, as Dallas had mentioned, resources, the resource industry, when I first was coming to this conference and offered to speak, I was like, well, what am I going to speak about? Like, I kind of feel like a fish out of water, but actually, no, I feel very well placed within this conference because so many people have come up to us since I started working for ICLD, asking for how to action a reconciliation. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christine?
Hi, I'm Christine Roberts, and I'm part of the Weewakam First Nations, and I'm a Leekwitok archaeologist, and we take care of the Cultural Resource Management Department. I have 3 other guys working underneath me, and we take care of all the archaeology and large cultural cedars. And to tell you the truth, I thought it was the wrong crowd here too. But as an archaeologist, most resource people aren't happy to see you because you definitely stick a spoke in their wheels there because they leave it for the end. They don't realize that everywhere you go in BC is an archaeology site pretty much. If you're going down the road and you happen to say, oh, wow, that looks like a pretty good place to camp. Well, people have camped there pretty much. So trying to work with my chief, who's economic development degree, and work together and try to balance our archaeology, our cultural values with our resource management. And it's getting there. And I think that if we all just, one thing archaeology does is slows you down. Takes 8 months to get a permit from BC ARC branch and stuff, but it also gives you a chance to take a look at the big picture, because it's not just archaeology. If there's no fish, the bears don't eat the fish don't get by the trees don't grow, so it's a big cycle. So it's interesting of how are we going to protect our sites, manage our animals, and do resource extraction at the same time. And I think there could be a pretty good balance there with it all. But like I said, I don't think there's going to be a lot of money, as much money as McMillan and Blodell made back in the day, maybe. But I think there's enough for us to continue on and have a really good balance based on our Indigenous ways and the environmental actions that are happening and everything today. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, all three of you. As we've sort of been talking about, whether it is the actual development of resources or securing the future protection of resources, which is another important tangent of the discussion that we try to have here at BC IROC. It takes people with professional backgrounds and traditional ecological knowledge and the patience, but also the clarity to make sure that some of these issues make it to the forefront. I know as we've gotten caught up in the need for economic development, we haven't asked as many questions in the earlier days as we probably do now because of the potential impacts of ARC sites and spiritual sites and other things like that. But you know, Alex, why don't you start us off and talk about some of the day-to-day things you do, you know, starting off on just understanding what we have around us now as it kind of relates back to our, you know, Aboriginal right and our connections to our lands and resources. And I know it's one thing to sit here in a conference and talk to people, but I know you put your cork boots on and you actually get out into the into the territories, and just give us some of your reflections on actually being out in the territory and experiencing some of these things.
All right, Dallas always gives me the large open-ended questions, and I'm sure we'll all do our best to answer them. There's obviously multiple layers to this discussion, but I'll try to keep it brief and really reflect on my own experiences as an Indigenous youth on my own territory. So as I mentioned earlier, I did start off working as a Indigenous Stewardship Guardian. So that was actually my first time really being in my territory and in my own waters. And if you think of that displacement within a couple generations, my grandmother grew up in Colleguise, Turner Island, and grew up speaking Kwakwala and had a very large family. They attended their small schoolhouse in the village site. You know, they laughed and played with their brothers and sisters. They ate food from the land. And to think in her lifetime, she passed away when I was about 16 years old. She went from that to, you know, moving to Vancouver and working what people would consider a normal job. And then, you know, starting her own family, of course, having my mother, and then opening her own business in Campbell River later on in her life. That is a significant change in how someone lives their life, the values that they follow, the society that they integrate themselves into. And I often find that the washback from that, you know, really affects me and my family. You know, we feel it. I feel the lack of my language. I know some words, and I can pronounce them, and I can say hello, good morning, good day, things like that. And yet I don't know the most basic foods that, you know, our family would have relied on a couple generations ago. I don't know where to go fishing. I only barely know how to strip cedar bark. And these are competency and skills that have been lost. So a lot of First Nations folks really reflect on that when it comes to, you know, relating to land and culture. And people need to kind of understand it's a sensitive spot. You know, it's something that we're trying to regain and we're trying to reteach our communities. I myself am a strong advocate for collecting plants, but it's just a personal preference. I really enjoy plant harvesting, but it's deeper than that. It's connecting with my territory and understanding the seasons and the wildlife and the history of that place. So when I talk about Indigenous science, as I mentioned earlier, it's really about your worldview and where you fit into that worldview. I think we're all very accustomed to hierarchies and power structures nowadays in the society we operate in, and you know, they work for efficiency. But there are a lot of issues for First Nations folks trying to integrate into those systems because of the fact that we didn't see the world that way. You know, everything was a great big circle and you were somewhere a part of it. So being on the land and interacting with my territory is definitely one of those things that reminds me that I can be part of the circle again. I can be part of the flow. And I can do that through cultural teaching and connecting with my land. So that's a really big piece for First Nations folks, is having the opportunity, the capacity, and the resources to connect with their territories again. That's one of the biggest first steps to, you know, connecting with that Indigenous knowledge and science. And everybody thinks it's super complicated, but it's not. It's about getting out there and understanding the natural processes that are occurring. And as a forester, thankfully, I have, you know, even deeper knowledge into that, and I really like that, you know, two ways of science can really combine and help give you a better perspective of the land. Now, I'm not trying to give a tangent about Indigenous science, but just, you know, back up this point, that really changes how I personally think about land management. So I try to bring that perspective in my day-to-day work at Nanwakolas, and I also try to teach ways that people can find that perspective on their own when they're engaging with First Nations, or whether they are the First Nations who are working in land development. And it's a really slippery, complex, nuanced slope. There are so many different situations, complexities, you know, differences in every scenario. But the most important part, the basis of all of this, is the relationships. The relationship you have with the land, the relationship you have with yourself, the relationship you have with values and how you practice them in your life, and the relationship with those metaphorically around the table with you. You know, how do you interact with them? You know, how do your actions impact them? You have to address those things before you even consider anything to do with managing the land. And I like what Christine said about slowing it down. I think sometimes, even myself, we all get in the rush of every day. I must be productive. Things that I do must be efficient. And yet, a lot of times that rushing makes us miss opportunities where we could pause and actually learn more, so that the things we're doing are more effective or more meaningful or more respectful or better for building relationships. I know this is all very general and vague, but as I said, you can't really give specifics until you're into the situation. But I'm hoping that by sharing this perspective, people can get a better idea of kind of the nuance that we deal with at Nanwakolas when we're representing the member nations. We're trying to, you know, understand their priorities, the things that they need, and work on behalf of them to make sure they can accomplish all of those goals, which is a very difficult job. On my resume, though, it says that I provide technical and support services to the Haumea Stewardship Guardians. I run cultural awareness training for non-Indigenous organizations or partner organizations to Nanwakolas, where I educate folks about Kwakwaka'wakw culture. And mostly, I kind of stick my nose everywhere and try to figure out how can we integrate Indigenous science and worldviews and values into the work that we're doing. But I'm happy to talk more about work later, so I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much, Alex. I mean, it's obvious you paid attention at the dinner table to all the aunts and uncles that were sharing perspectives. But Sharon, you know, last night, you know, Auntie Lolly Good just took control of a room that has a lot of egos, a lot of people who just kind of go to the beat of their own drum. But you know, in your role as helping to train, you know, and focusing on women, I think we lose focus of the fact that it's aunties and matriarchs who help make our society stronger now, specifically Indigenous communities. You know, people like myself and Chief Roberts get to stand up and wax poetically, but it's based on the latitude given to us from the matriarchs within our community. So maybe just some of your comments. I mean, the way she stood up and just told everybody to grab a rattle. I said something a little jokingly last night, like if I stood up and said everybody grab a rattle, I'd have to say it about 10 times. Dan Jepson would have to do his whistle. I'd have to start picking on people to come up and do it. But the power of this matriarch from Snuneymuxw just decided that this is how this discussion's going to go, and she helped do that. So maybe just some of your comments on the training that you do to help prepare our Indigenous women and girls into playing that role and making sure that those hard discussions are going to be forefront?
Yeah, I didn't make it last night, but I know of Auntie Lolly and that particular piece that she did with the rattles, because I was at a different conference where she did that, and you know, back prior to colonization, many of our Indigenous communities were matriarchal, and so it's really interesting because I was at a conference recently in Harrison Hot Springs, and one of the Indigenous fellow elders came and spoke to us, and he was telling us about about matriarchy and how many of the communities were matriarchal. The men would get up first. The men would always, the focus was on the men doing this and that first. And from the outside, like it kind of floored me. From the outside looking in, you would think that was a male-dominated culture or community, but really it was the men stand up first, they get fed first, and it's all done to protect the women, because the women were the ones that ruled. That it was a matriarchal society. So we want to get back to that, and the question again is, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm sorry.
No, just on your perspective on how important it is to continue to make sure that we train and support specifically women, but not just women, but how do we continue to train people to play that leadership role that you work in?
Well, the women need to feel empowered, and women have lost their power, and so empowering Indigenous women is extremely important, and especially at a young age. We've got the whole murdered and missing and Indigenous women and girls issue that is at the forefront, and so that is something that we need to work on eradicating, but the importance of with the corporate side of ICLD, we work with the organizations to train them on reconciliation and how to work with organizations, Indigenous organizations, the right way. They want to build relationships. They want to work with Indigenous organizations. They have to learn, or they should learn the Indigenous worldview that was mentioned. All of what was mentioned so far is extremely important, and training Indigenous women is vital to Indigenous communities thriving. And I'll leave it at that.
No, so important, and you're so right. And Christine, we've known each other a long time, and I know you've worked very hard for a living. You've tree planted. I know you worked with the Bakwamgala language group with Alex's grandmother, and other people within the community. And as you continued your studies into your specialization with archaeology, just some of your thoughts on kind of your journey and the importance of making sure that we understand more about the past as we prepare for the future.
Well, I've been doing the culture monitoring for the last 22 years, and I'll tell you at the beginning, boy, there was an old boys club everywhere you went. The logging companies, the band office, organizations, and I read an article about 20 years ago, and it was in the 1970s, and it said that Canada didn't even feel that Indigenous women were human. Yeah. And that's really hard to take, because you even see it today. Like a couple of years ago, when that non-Native woman went missing in Port Coquitlam, it was all over the news for months. Meanwhile, there was 2 other Indigenous women missing, and it didn't even make the news. So yeah, a lot's changed in the last 20 years. And I see that it's so different now for our younger people, like my kids coming up. My boys have been competing with girls and losing to them running all the time. When I first came into I was the only girl out there. Everybody was a guy, the boat handler, the forester. And then one day I went out and the guy running the boat was a girl. The forester was a girl. The archaeologist I went out with was a girl. It was just, and now you see a lot of times in the forest industry, the young students that come out are women. Like young girls are doing it. So I've seen a lot of change over the years, and I think it's really good. But it is still we still have a long way to go. If I'm with our non-native archaeology people and I go to a site and I come up, they automatically think I'm just a monitor, like that's the only thing an Indigenous person can be. And they're always shocked when the other archaeologist says, nope, this is an archaeologist too. And then they start to click in. But like I had an experience in Calma River during COVID on the highway when you still had to do the sewers and everything on the highway. But they had found some archaeology, like a human bone, and they never had the archaeology done, so they got shut down. And then when they came back, we were invited to be the monitors, and they never talked to us for 6 months. All the people on the highway, nobody would say anything to us. I don't know if it's because we're Indigenous women, but it took a lot. And then one day, they were all arguing. All those men were fighting. It was a hot summer day. And I said to them, hey, you guys. And they all looked at me. I said, you missed your bus, and it was an adult care bus. So, but after that, they were more talkative and open and stuff like that. So it's just like, it just takes a bit of time. But now we have young people like Alex coming up as a forester. Like, wow, that's so cool. And so times are changing, and I hope it balances everything out better for everybody.
Please, yeah.
Yes, times are changing, but we're still a long ways away. So women are still overrepresented in the women are overrepresented in the carceral system. It's just surprising. The statistics. I think it's like 63% are Indigenous women in the carceral system. So I just had to mention that.
No, and I think these are all important because the social values need to be part of the decision-making factor. We've talked as Indigenous people about the importance for economic gain, but not at the cost of ecology or protection of lands and resources, but the social situations that we still find ourselves in. We're generating some revenue, we have access to credit, we're able to kind of cover over some of those fundamental flaws that still exist in our community. And it's important to keep this discussion going because it matters. I hate to admit that it's gotten more real for me since I've had 3 young daughters. There was things that I never really thought about from a different perspective until I realized, wow, how is someone going to treat my girls in this situation? One wants to be a marine biologist, one wants to be an oncologist, and the other one wants to work for Erica Roberts, the office manager at Nanwakolas. She's hiding out there somewhere. But we just need to make sure that we do things better across the spectrum. But we talked about the youth and the training, and it's important to keep this going. Alex, what's some of your experience as you've been working, you were once a student within the program itself. Now you help play a support role in working with not only young kids, but middle-aged kids who've come to find a different career within stewardship. What's some of your thoughts on just the support that you provide and some of the work that needs to be done to make sure that we continue to make stewardship an inviting place for people to grow careers?
Another loaded question. There's a lot of things. Once again, I'll just start by saying it's always nuanced, right? There's always different situations and complexities. And when speaking with First Nations, you have to acknowledge that there's never blanket statements for anything. And I always like to disclose that at the start because there's no silver bullet. When you're working with a lot of First Nations communities, I think we kind of touched on this about, Indigenous women's rights and disparities that women face in these communities, is a lot of times we're very colonized in our thinking in our communities, and people aren't aware of that. But it's the truth, We have that colonized mindset, and we don't necessarily have matriarchal societies anymore, but we're trying to work to get back to that. These are hopeful things, but they're difficult things to navigate. And it requires a lot of patience, discussion, relationship building. And that's why often working with First Nations can be very challenging, because internally there is work that is going on, that external partners are not a part of, or maybe don't see, all of the details ongoing. So that's the first part I kind of want to acknowledge, that people need to realize that it is happening within Indigenous communities. The second part is that, some Indigenous folks have more access to opportunity. I was very fortunate. My mother herself went to university before me, so there was a precedent set. But I grew up with a lot of Indigenous friends and cousins who grew up on the reservation who maybe didn't have those examples in front of them, did not realize the possibilities that were open to them in their future or in their careers. So that's part of what I do to support others, is really advocate for them to, take that leap of faith, to not be scared to share their voices or their teachings, to show up in spaces that maybe don't reflect them very well or their culture, but to share what they know, and to take that opportunity that time has given us right now, to take the stage, and to just show up authentically as who they are. Because being an Indigenous person means that you're existing in a system that's not your own. It means you aren't going to necessarily fit in flawlessly, and that's the point, is you kind of have to be a little disruptive to the system, or stand out a little, to bring awareness to your cause and your values. So when I support Indigenous youth, or when I try to support Indigenous youth, I try to, give them that courage to do so, to stand up, for their beliefs and their teachings. It's very difficult. I will say, especially if they don't have examples to follow, then it's almost impossible for them to realize how much of the world is at their fingertips. And that's why I think the work of, the three of us is really important, because we show up in these spaces and we give them that example, and we show them opportunities. And even if they don't end up an archaeologist or a forester, or they don't, necessarily go into the jobs we expect them to, it still, gives them that empowerment, where they realize I am powerful, and that I do have a voice, and that I'm from a society where that's very important. A lot of times Indigenous cultures talk about how women are sacred. And I never heard the word sacred once within my 5 years at university. So a lot of people kind of maybe wonder what that means or what the relevance is. But it's really understanding the roles and responsibilities we have to play within our lives as women in our communities. We bear a lot of emotion, we bear a lot of trauma, we bear a lot of weight for the children and family members that we support and uplift every single day. We bear a lot of strength, we try to uplift everybody with us if we can. It's not always possible, but these are things that especially Indigenous young women have to come into in some form or other. And if they don't have the tools or supports to get through that, then of course they're gonna feel disheartened. They're gonna feel like they're going through a struggle all alone. So part of the work we do at Nanwakolas is really enlightening to see. We have a lot of young folks coming up. As Christine mentioned, she has 3 young men working under her, and they're very respectful, very talented, and they're starting to hear these cultural teachings in their workspace every day. So that's one of the ways we really try to integrate and pass that message on, because it's not just for women to do all the work. We need everybody else to join in too. It's too heavy a load for us to just carry. But especially with young folks, I think it's extremely influential to uplift them, empower them, and give them those spaces, where they can share what's special about them. And I think the 3 of us do that regularly, but I hope that gives them insight into the things that we hope young people can achieve, and we try to pass along in these spaces.
Please, Christine.
Oh, I just see these questions here. That's kind of cool. We are looking into our own permitting system, and a lot of First Nations do have already done the permitting system. So we're not gonna make up our own. We're just gonna borrow from other. There's some really good ones out there. The Comox one's really good. And yeah, so in our community, we do involve our youth in the sciences. So we have a project going on through Nanwakolas, which is the clam gardens. And clam gardens are pretty cool things. The more you dig, the more you get. So we're incorporating our little language school. I think we got the first 3 grades of a language school started. And we're bringing them out and teaching them. We're going to turn the clam gardens over, take a look at it. And there's a lot of science in clam gardens, how they were made, the angles they were made, what was put in them. So there's a lot of science out there in the archaeology world for our youth, and we're incorporating it. I just wanted to answer the question.
You took that was my next question itself. I noticed you've been working with the youth and talking about the Loki Way, the clam gardens that have been out there. But I think beyond that, you know, I'm glad that we're starting to have that discussion around how does archaeological assessments and how do we permit that? And we need to do some of our own, because BC Arc Branch tries to do something from a certain perspective, but it's not adequate enough for our communities. I think that's been made very clear to us. But I think you made a good point that, you know, Comox has a good system they've developed. I know the Kitasoo have a system where anyone who's doing any data or research or artwork in their territories has to get a permit from them. It's one thing to get a permit from Arc Branch, but that's just the start of the discussion. There's other nations who said, you're not going to do that in our territories until you get that permission from us to do that. And so I think that's a wonderful discussion that we really need to keep going. Sharon, maybe you can, you know, have a shot at this one. Indigenous women have always had a deep connection with the land. How can we work with industry to re-strengthen that relationship to ensure their safety?
Yeah, well, like I said before, we have to empower women to feel that they're safe first. So let's get them out of the carceral system. Let's stop the domestic violence that's taking place. I'm working with women coming out of domestic violence, and these women are terrified, and you know, we just need to stop making Indigenous women victims and empowering them, because once they have that sense of empowerment, like Alex said, women are sacred. We are life givers. We are creators. So Indigenous women have always had a deep connection with the land, and working with industry to re-strengthen that relationship would include things like industry understanding the history of Canada and Indigenous peoples, like really understanding the history of what happened to us over the last 500 years, and once you have an understanding, then you know you can work to relationship build, and that will re-strengthen relations on both sides.
Tremendous. Christine, I know you're doing some work with the youth. I know you brought, you know, Chief Roberts' daughter Ari out on a couple of your jobs. And what do you see? I mean, I know you've kind of had to take some challenges on as you go. You talked about the old boys club that was there as you came in there. What do you think needs to be part of a mentoring program specifically for our young Aboriginal women to make sure that they get, you know, the most creative opportunity to continue to be able to play roles like Alexandra and Sharon and yourself have played, but just some of your thoughts on what can we do more to support our young girls and give them the confidence that they need?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I think in our community, like you said, Ari, my little cousin there, the chief's daughter, she had a sign on the door saying acting chief when he wasn't there one day, something like that. So I was like, yeah, there's my girl. So she's kind of my host. I have this little dream of doing this documentary with the language kids, and Ari's my host. And then I have another young guy that is really interested in filming and editing and stuff. So he's my filmer, and we did our first one went up to a mountain where 3 of our carvers are carving a canoe out in the mountain. They found a tree that was down, and they're carving it. And it's just nice to what we're trying to do is trying to get the girls involved, because it seems like everything's for boys, like the hunting, and a lot of the boys don't. But I have one girl that's right into the hunting, and she's what, 15 now, Scarlett, and they have to know how to clean it all before they let them hunt it. So now she gets to hunt it, so that's pretty cool. And just opening the door to make our young girls feel comfortable. We were hoping to have like a little community tea, you know how like on reserves before, I know when my great-grandmother and my grandmothers were alive, they used to have these little teas, and everybody brought their real nice little teacup kind of thing, and just kind of inviting them to stuff like that and opening them a door to make them feel more comfortable is a start, I think.
Plus, you know, if they can see it, right? They can be it, have it, do it. So giving them more opportunities to see women in different occupations, from the trades all the way through to like archaeologists. Like, that's not a typical female role, an archaeologist, right? It's a male-dominated role.
It used to be, but it's
Not-
pretty much outfield. But we also have, in our community, we have a woman, my cousin that's a doctor, nurses,
Yeah,
lawyers.
and so young women need to see more of these opportunities, and so they can dream about it, and see themselves in those positions.
You know, this is incredible, and I think this is a discussion that's going to spur on many going forward. I think of organizations like the College of Professional Biologists and other places like that, where we can go right to the tree and make sure that the professional organizations that oversee the development of programs like this are having those real discussions with real community members. Because for far too long, whether it's, you know, RPF, which was a very male-dominated industry, the biologists, all those sorts of things are starting to try head in the right direction, but they need some of that, you know, push, some of that movement, and some of that people aren't afraid, like these 3 talented ladies beside me. So unfortunately, time's always the biggest enemy of a great discussion, but I think we've all learned a lot, and I think you've given us all a lot to think about, and specifically the men who play roles in this room of making sure that we break some of these circles. You know, just because our dads or uncles gave our male cousins the first chances to do things like that have been talked about, we need to make sure that we're inclusive in our own communities, because that's how the resource sector is going to start to better understand that, if it starts at home first. So on behalf of BC IROC and Nanwakolas Council, I'd just like to thank you all for ending this panel portion of the agenda on such an important factor that affects all of our communities and all of our society. So, Gaila Kasla, thank you.